Let's talk tissues. And first, we'll revisit the levels of organization in anatomy, and we'll note that the tissue level is in between the cell and the organ levels, meaning that cells combine to form tissues, tissues combine to form organs. A more specific definition of tissues is groups of similar cells working together to perform a function. And there are lots of cells in your body that combine to form tissues. You've got more than 75 trillion cells in the body. And a trillion is one of these numbers that our human minds can barely comprehend, right? You can look up how many dollar bills would you stack up to make a trillion. I guess you would stack up a trillion of them. But how high would it be? I was going to give you some little anecdotes like this, but it's a lot. However, you can group these 75 trillion cells into about 200 different types of cell. And then these cells combine actually only 4 major types of tissues. So we'll really focus on the tissue level from here on out in this class. The 4 tissue types are epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissue. And you're welcome to tweak the language here a bit. You could call muscle tissue muscular tissue. You could call nervous tissue neural tissue if you'd like. And our goal right now is just to summarize in one word, maybe 2 words, what each of these tissue types have as their function. So epithelial tissue covers things. And I'm going to throw in here lines, covers and lines things, meaning you'll find epithelial tissue on the outside of things, like my skin is epithelial tissue, but you'll also find it lining the inside of things, like blood vessels and organs and such. Connective tissue basically connects, although it does a lot more than that. Muscle tissue contracts. And nervous tissue, you could say commands. Or if you'd like, you could say communicates. What you'll see here is that each of these short words starts with C. So sometimes these are called the 4 C's. Covers, connects, contracts, and commands are the major functions of these 4 types of tissue. And from here on out, what we're going to do is just look at each of these tissue types more closely, their structure and their function and where you'd find them in the body, starting with epithelial tissue. So, what is unique about epithelial tissue? What characteristics and functions do epithelial tissues play out in the body? One is that their cells fit closely together. If you were to think about blood, with all of that plasma separating the red blood cells and white blood cells, that's pretty clearly not a type of epithelial tissue. Something else you'll see in epithelial tissue is that the cells are arranged in sheets. Again, blood is not something that's arranged in sheets. Your neurons are not arranged in sheets. So this is very characteristic of epithelial tissue. This tissue has polarity, meaning that there's a top and a bottom to the tissue. Or better would be an apical surface and a basal surface. Red blood cells don't really have a top or bottom. In epithelial tissue, you also will see a basement membrane, a structure that the epithelial cells will attach themselves to. And epithelial cells are avascular. So this is the time when you want to start memorizing some of the terminology to help you with what may be new words like avascular. Remember, the cardiovascular system is the system that has the heart, cardio, and the vessels, vascular. So avascular means without vascularization. Another way to say it is epithelial tissue is what lets you take a safety pin and shove it into your skin without causing it to bleed, like I did earlier. I can take that out. So no blood vessels means no blood when traumatized. If you cut deeper into your skin, you'll eventually reach blood vessels, but those are tucked deep down in your skin in some connective tissue, not in epithelial tissue. Last, as a characteristic of epithelial tissue, is that it's highly regenerative, meaning this tiny little hole I punched in my finger with the safety pin will be gone quite quickly, because as that old dead skin flakes off into my house, new cells will be behind it, taking its place. As far as the functions of epithelial tissue goes, here's a full list: protection, absorption, filtration, sensation, and secretion. But those will make more sense if we talk about them one at a time as we look at the different epithelial tissues performing these functions. Okay, so if there are multiple kinds of epithelial tissue, how are we going to tell them apart? How will we classify them? Well, there's really two ways. One is that we can look at the shape of the cells and classify them by shape. Squamous cells are thin and flat and have this kind of squished nuclei appearance. So in this squamous cell, squamous, by the way, means scale. You know, like the scale on a fish is very flat and thin. So that's what squamous cells look like. Cuboidal cells mean they're cube-shaped. You know, like a box. And by the way, oid, O-I-D, that means shaped like or resembles. So really, cuboidal means resembling a cube in its shape. And you'll see that nucleus is usually right around the center of the cube. And that's important because the next type of cell shape is columnar. These are shaped like columns, but the nuclei usually sit near the base. So that helps distinguish them from cuboidal cells. And then one other shape of cell you can see is called a transitional cell shape. And these cells, as the name implies, can transition from dome-shaped to kind of a flatter, squamous-y shape. So these are some of the cells in epithelial tissue. But to create epithelial tissue, these cells may or may not be stacked, because you can also classify epithelial tissue by layers. If you don't stack these cells, you would have what we call a simple epithelial layer. It would just be one layer of cells. Like here, I can see several squamous cells. The nuclei are all at the same level. And you would find these simple layers deep inside the body. These layers are only one cell thick, right? So any significant trauma will easily tear these cells apart. But if you stack a bunch of layers of cells together, that can be more protection. So we call that stratified. You may have heard the term strata before, like there's a layer of the atmosphere called the stratosphere. There are the strata in geology, like in the Grand Canyon, all those bands of colors of rocks. Those are the strata. So this is like these layers. It just means layered. And you'd find these where there are more stresses. Like our skin is going to be stratified because it experiences a lot of stress and trauma. But other parts of the body may encounter more chemical stresses. One other type of layer inside the human body is called pseudostratified, means falsely stratified. We'll talk about that a little later on. Okay, so we have all the terminology we need now to start naming the types of tissues. And pretty much we're just going to mix and match the terms we just learned to create tissue names. Meaning I can take the term simple, and then I can either grab the word squamous or cuboidal or columnar and start combining those to make tissue types. So the first most basic type of epithelial tissue is simple squamous epithelium. Or you can say simple squamous epithelial tissue. We'll find this lining a lot of places because that's one of the main jobs of epithelial tissue, like lining the body cavities, lining the inside of the heart, lining the inside of blood vessels. There are some parts of the kidneys that have simple squamous epithelium, and some parts of the lungs, little kind of bubble-shaped structures called alveoli. So that's kind of a strange mix of body parts. What is simple squamous epithelium doing in all of these places? What are its functions? Well, one thing simple squamous can do is reduce friction. Think of simple and squamous as slippery. They make a slippery layer. So inside your heart and inside your blood vessels, you've got blood moving around at a pretty good clip. As those cells get banged around, you want them to easily slide off the inside of these chambers. So simple squamous helps with that. Simple squamous is also very, very thin. It's, the thinnest tissue in your body because it's only one cell thick, and those cells are squashed very flat and thin. So if you want diffusion to take place somewhere in the body, simple squamous epithelium is going to be what you'd expect to see there. For example, when you take a deep breath in of air, there's a lot of oxygen in that air, and you want it to leave the lungs, leave the alveoli of the lungs, these little bubble shapes, and move into the blood. So alveoli, their walls have to be very, very thin. They're made of simple squamous epithelium. So the oxygen can easily diffuse out. And you want to get it into the blood, right? So right next to the alveoli are little capillaries. The capillaries walls are one cell thick, as thin as you can get. They are made also of simple squamous epithelium. So now, to get that oxygen you breathe in from your lungs into your blood, the oxygen only has to diffuse the length of, or the thickness of 2 flat, small cells. You also find simple squamous epithelium in the kidney for the same reason. In fact, this picture here in the lower right corner shows some flat little nuclei. Simple squamous make up this little capsule. And we'll get into the details on this one more, but the short story is your kidneys filter your blood. So you want to let the bad stuff out of your blood. Well, if you want something to get in or out of somewhere, give them a nice thin layer, simple squamous layer to help stuff enter or exit your body. And finally, simple squamous epithelium can play a role in secretion. Honestly, we'll talk not much about that. Here's what a stack of, a sheet rather, of simple squamous epithelium might look like, but the histology can look different. That's something we'll practice in lab. Okay, what if you stack up these simple squamous cells? Then you'll have stratified squamous epithelium. And some of the places you'll find that are your skin, like your outer skin, lining your oral cavity, lining your throat, your esophagus, your rectum, anus, and vagina. Something that all of these places have in common is that they're somewhat exposed to the environment, and they may at times have something rough moving through them. Feces, penis during reproductive processes, chewed up Doritos as an example of something crunchy and sharp would be Doritos. All of those have the potential of doing damage to the body, so stratified squamous epithelium provides a nice thick layer for protection. One thing to take note of, though, is that this type of tissue may or may not be keratinized. What I mean by that is that when I took this safety pin and I pushed it through my epithelial tissue, really I just went through some dead cells that were full of keratin. They're keratinized, very tough, dry, dead, packed with this protein called keratin. That makes a very rough but very good protective layer to the outer skin. You don't want your esophagus, though, to be coated in like a rough, dry skin like this. You still need it to be thick because those Doritos are real sharp when you crunch them up and swallow them. So you need a thick protective layer, but you don't want a rough, dry one. So the esophagus is non-keratinized. The vagina is non-keratinized. The oral cavity is mostly non-keratinized. And you can tell the difference if you stick out your tongue and kind of feel around at the skin on the outer part of your lip, and then retract your tongue. And right around here on your lip, you should feel it goes from being kind of rough to all of a sudden being very smooth. That's the transition from keratinized stratified squamous epithelium to non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. And again, it's all about protection. How about some of these cube-shaped cells? How about simple cuboidal epithelium? Well, the main thing this tissue does for your body is make glands, ducts, and tubes. So we will see this primarily in the kidneys and in some of the glands we'll talk about in a few minutes. And yeah, these are just building these ducts so that substances can be transported through them. But the functions of simple cuboidal epithelium include secretion. What I mean is that let's do some glands in your body. The cells are making this tube shape. And then at the bottom, the tube kind of coils up to make the gland. But all of the cells that make the tube shape are also creating the stuff going into the tube. We'll see some more examples of this and how we make tubes and glands. But basically, these cells not only make tubes, they secrete stuff into the tubes. They can also absorb things, although we won't talk about that quite so much. Okay, what if you start stacking those cells up? Then you get a stratified cuboidal epithelium. So if we look at some of our images here, we'll find that there's a lumen, which is the open space on the inside of a duct that things travel through. And then there'll be a series of cells forming one layer of tissue. And then there'll be a second series of cells forming a second layer of tissues. This thing isn't 30 layers thick, it's just 2 or 3 cell layers thick, but it makes a beefier tube. And you'll see these in sweat glands and in mammary glands. And as I mentioned already, these cells are not just forming the tube shape, but they're also secreting the sweat or secreting the milk into that tube. Simple columnar epithelium, just one single row of column-shaped cells. These are found lining the stomach, intestine, gallbladder, and uterine tubes, among other places. So it may not seem like those areas have a lot in common. We'll talk a little bit more about it. A major function of simple columnar epithelium is for absorption. So the most important region of the body that has simple columnar epithelium for your survival is the intestines, specifically the small intestines, because that's where you have a simple columnar epithelium with microvilli that are going to help increase surface area to expose your cells more to the food you ate to help absorb the nutrients. Simple columnar epithelium can also participate in secretion. So in other parts of your digestive system, rather than absorbing, these cells are secreting something, like some digestive enzymes or something. you will find that some regions of simple columnar epithelium have goblet cells. We'll talk about those later on, but they make mucus because your digestive tract has to have a lot of mucus to protect yourself from, the hydrochloric acid that your stomach is making, for example. But other parts of simple columnar epithelium will have cilia. And remember from our previous discussion, cilia is used to move substances over the surface of cells. So, why do we have simple columnar epithelium in the uterine tubes, aka the fallopian tubes? Because they make a current to help move the egg from the ovary into the fallopian tube and down towards the uterus. So, simple columnar epithelium, it's got a lot going on. Multiple functions in different parts of the body with different goals. Stratified columnar epithelium, much more straightforward. It makes some glands, some of the big ducts inside glands, like in the salivary glands. However, this is a good image to use to explain one other concept. When you start to stack up cells, they might look different from each other. In other words, the first layer of cells in a tissue may look columnar shaped, but the cells in the deeper layers may be more cuboidal, or maybe they get even more squamous, get flattened. When you're naming a type of tissue, all you care about is finding that lumen. There's always going to be one in epithelial tissue because remember, it's always covering something or lining something. So there's always some open space that they're next to. So find that lumen and then just ask yourself, what shape is that first layer of cells? Don't worry about the shape of the other epithelial cells. The name comes from that first or apical layer, the top layer. All right, transitional epithelium. This one is unique to the urinary system, so you'll find it in the bladder and the ureters. And as the name implies, and as we mentioned, these can change shape. And they're changing shape as these organs expand, because as the bladder fills, it will need to stretch out. So what will look like kind of bubbly dome cells, the name of these bubbly apical cells are called dome cells. They might look like domes, but then as the bladder fills, they get stretched thin and they look maybe more squamousy. Then, after the urine leaves the bladder or leaves the ureter, the relaxation of the organ will make the dome cells come back. The final type of epithelial tissue is PCCE, pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. As a very evocative image of what pseudo means, here is a hyena clitoris. That's right. It looks like a penis. It's not. We call that a pseudopenis. It's a false penis. The thing about hyenas is that it's a matriarchal society. The females run the show. And if you want to be the biggest, baddest female and get all the best food and all the best mates, you got to be really tough. And what hormone makes us tough? Testosterone. And what hormone makes your genitalia look like a penis? Testosterone. So hyenas are very exciting animal models to study. But this is just to remind us, pseudo-stratified means it's not really stratified, it's falsely stratified. It's as false as that pseudo-penis is. Of course, these other words are important too. Cilia will always be present in PCCE. The cells will be column-shaped, and we can see that here. Cilia present, check. The top row of cells should be column-shaped, check. And because this appears stratified but really isn't, what's going on here is basically that you have some cells that will look like they don't touch the bottom layer of this tissue type, but they do. They'll have some skinny little bit that's always going to reach down to the basement membrane. So all of the cells you see in these images, they all actually do reach down to the basement membrane, whether it looks like they do or not. The nuclei end up getting all staggered, so it looks like a stratified layer, but this is pseudo-stratified. The big giveaway is the cilia. If you see cilia, you should be thinking it's either going to be PCCE or simple columnar. And those are pretty easy to tell those two apart. The places we find PCCE in the body are the nasal cavity, trachea, bronchi, and portions of the male reproductive tract. We'll really just stick with talking about the airway. Most of those structures I named are part of your airway. So the functions of PCCE in your airway are secretion and moving stuff, moving mucus across the cell surface. As you breathe in and out, or let's talk about breathing in. As you breathe in air that maybe your nose hairs will keep out like a mosquito or something, but there's going to be all kinds of tiny particles inside that air that you need to capture some other way. So you have a very mucousy airway, and the job of the cilia is to move that mucus. Through a whip-like pattern, it will move the mucus, always just one direction. So in the case of the lungs, the trachea, and the bronchi, all that cilia is constantly pushing the mucus up your airway so that you can swallow it and your stomach acid will kill stuff, or you can spit out that dirty mucus. Constantly making more and more mucus and moving it up and out of your airway. When we see the respiratory system, we'll learn more about what this has to do with smoker's cough, for example. Okay, so we'll finish by talking about glands, because glandular tissue is made out of epithelial tissue. Glands are one or more epithelial cells that make some kind of secretion. And there's two types of glands. Exocrine glands make stuff that will directly or indirectly exit the body. So these secretions will go through ducts to reach the epithelial surface. Here you can see a bunch of epithelial cells. They are making some secretion. It's traveling through a duct and reaching the surface. And there's a blood vessel here because these cells will need some nutrients to help keep making all these secretions. This blood vessel is not in the epithelial tissue, it's next to it. That's different from an endocrine gland where everything stays within the body. Endocrine glands make hormones that go into the blood. There's no duct necessary. Here you can see a cluster of endocrine cells. They are both receiving nutrition from the blood to make this hormone product, and they're dumping the hormone directly into the blood. So let's look at the different exocrine and endocrine glands in your body. All of these exocrine glands make substances that go to an epithelial surface. The most obvious epithelial surface is the surface of your skin. Sebaceous glands make oil. It reaches the surface of your skin. Sudoriferous glands make sweat. It can reach the surface of your skin. Mammary glands make milk. Ceruminous glands make earwax. Lacrimal glands make tears. All of that stuff we can see on the surface of our skin. But be careful. The real definition of these exocrine glands is that the secretion reaches an epithelial surface. So PCCE lines my trachea, and that's an epithelial surface. So when goblet cells make mucus, I might not ever see this mucus, but it is reaching an epithelial surface. It's reaching the lining of my trachea. What about these gastric glands in my stomach making digestive enzymes? I'm never really going to see those, but the enzymes go to an epithelial surface, the inside of my stomach. The pancreas makes enzymes that go to an epithelial surface, the inside lining of my intestines. So all of those are exocrine glands too. And that stuff will kind of indirectly eventually exit the body through feces. Even ovaries and testes are exocrine glands because sperm can exit the body, eggs can exit the body. All of these will reach some epithelial surface. The endocrine glands, you'll never see these hormones. They're just going to go into the blood, move throughout your body, and then eventually your body will break them down or you might pee them out. Some endocrine glands are the hypothalamus, pineal gland, pituitary gland, thyroid gland and parathyroid glands, thymus, adrenal glands, and pancreas, ovaries, and testes. What? The pancreas, ovaries, and testes are exocrine glands and endocrine glands because they make stuff that will exit the body and they make stuff that won't exit the body, hormones. So the pancreas makes hormones like insulin. Ovaries and testes make sex hormones like testosterone and estrogen. So they are doing double duty as exocrine and endocrine glands. The structure of these glands will vary a lot. Goblet cells are made of just one cell. They're your body's main unicellular exocrine gland. Goblet cells have a bunch of little vesicles full of mucus, and then they dribble out the mucus on the apical surface of the cell. You can see a ton of goblet cells in this image here. All these little alien egg-looking structures are goblet cells. But most exocrine glands are multicellular. They're going to have some glandular portion and then a duct to carry those secretions to the surface. And you can classify these exocrine glands by looking at how those ducts branch and then the shape of the secretory portion. We're not going to learn all these types of exocrine glands. We're just going to recognize that the ducts themselves can either be simple or compound. Meaning you can have a one simple duct, or here it's starting to branch out in different directions. And then the secretory portion, this kind of deeper portion of the gland, might be made of a series of tubes, like as shown here. Or these could be more kind of ball-shaped or pocket-shaped, which are called acinar or alveolar structures. Or they can be a combination of tubes and these alveoli. They can be called tubulo-alveolar. This isn't something we'll really study in detail. We just want to recognize that there's a lot of diversity in the shape of all these exocrine glands, which kind of makes sense. There was quite a long list of exocrine glands on the previous slides. Finally, how does all this stuff exit these exocrine glands? We know endocrine glands are passing the hormones into the blood, but exocrine glands have a lot of different ways by which they release their secretory products. There's three main types. I will actually start with the last here, holocrine secretion. And for me, that's always been easy to remember because what happens here is the whole cell explodes. When the whole cell explodes, that's one really messy way to release the product of the cell. And in fact, I always remember too that oil glands, or in anatomical parlance, sebaceous glands, are a type of holocrine secretion because, sweat, tears, none of those seem particularly gross to me, but oil is kind of gross. And I understand because the whole cell explodes along with all this oil coming out so too will the organelles and the cytosol and everything else. Apocrine secretion is when only the apex of the cell comes off. So when just the top part of the cell comes off, that's apocrine secretion. It sheds its apical region. Mammary glands are an example of this. Finally, merocrine secretion occurs when exocytosis lets just little bits of the secretory product to kind of drip or dribble out of the cell. And that's what we saw in goblet cells. That's also what happens in saliva and salivary glands. Epithelial tissue. There's a lot going on. It's a very important type of tissue in the body. Connective tissue also has a lot going on, and it's a very important type of tissue in the body. But once you get through epithelial tissue and connective tissue, the last section of tissues will be a little bit shorter. Muscle tissue, nervous tissue, we're going to dive into those in detail later in the semester. So for now, just gear up, get ready for a big chunk on epithelial, a big chunk on connective. That's going to be the majority of our lesson on tissues.